Hello class, welcome to the endocrine system. This week we're going to learn a lot about hormones, distinguishing between exocrine and endocrine functions, and looking at which organs and glands are part of the endocrine system, and how those hormones are regulated. So here's just a little picture of some of the glands and organs that are considered both endocrine and exocrine. Some of them have both endocrine and exocrine functions. However, salivary glands and mammary glands, those are just considered exocrine. So what does it mean to be exocrine or endocrine? If you remember when we talked about tissues, exocrine glands means that its product, its hormone or whatever it's secreting, is being secreted into a duct and then to a target gland or tissue. If a gland or organ is endocrine in function, that means that whatever it's secreting is going straight into the blood to be taken up by its target gland or tissue. The example here is the pancreas. The pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine functions. It's primarily exocrine, meaning that it secretes a lot of digestive juices that go into the small intestine and help us break down the food that we eat. But it also has endocrine function because, as we know, the pancreas plays a major role in diabetes because it secretes insulin. So it's a big player in bringing down our blood glucose. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the pancreas later on. So there are a lot of comparisons usually drawn between the endocrine system and the nervous system, which we covered last time, right? So the endocrine system has target cells on its tissue or gland that it's sending its hormone to. The process by which the hormone attaches to those target cells or to those receptors is called signal transduction because there are specific receptors for specific hormones. There is a difference between neurotransmitters and hormones, though they're both chemicals that create a reaction in our bodies. Neurotransmitters are secreted by a neuron and go to another neuron. So there are two neurons that are communicating with each other. Hormones are being secreted by an endocrine gland, and they're traveling by blood to somewhere else in the body. So it's not two neurons that are communicating. It's a hormone from a gland that's communicating with another tissue somewhere else. And a lot of the times those hormones have systemic effects. So they might cause changes to a lot of different parts of the body. Those hormones could be hypersecreted or hyposecreted. Either way, that's a pathological state, meaning that it will cause disease. So if they're hypersecreted, hyper means excessive. Think of somebody who is hyper. They're a little excessive, right? So hypersecretion means that hormone's being secreted too much. Hyposecretion, on the other hand, hypo means insufficient. So there's not enough of that hormone being produced. Now, can a chemical be both a neurotransmitter and a hormone? Yes. In different places in the body, specifically when we look at the adrenal medulla that is going to secrete things like epinephrine and norepinephrine, those names might sound really familiar when we talked about neurotransmitters, specifically the ones that are working in the sympathetic nervous system to create that fight or flight response. So epinephrine and norepinephrine can actually be produced in an endocrine gland, and if they're released by the adrenal medulla, then they can travel in the blood to create systemic effects in the body. But if they're secreted by a neuron, then they might be causing changes within the sympathetic nervous system itself, just the neurons talking to each other, communicating. Hormones can be separated by function and also by structure. When they're separated by function, they're either tropic hormones, sex hormones, or anabolic hormones. If we remember way back when we talked about cells and metabolism, anabolic means to build something up. Hormones can also be categorized by structure, And in this case, they're either steroid hormones or non-steroid hormones. Steroid hormones means that they are made from cholesterol. Non-steroid hormones are usually based on proteins or amino acid structures. Another thing to mention about steroid versus non-steroid hormones is that the structure of the hormone tells you how they can cross the cell membrane. So if we remember that the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer, it's made out of different types of lipids, and cholesterol is also a lipid. Therefore, steroid hormones have a really easy time crossing that cellular membrane. Non-steroid hormones, not so much. So they might need a specific receptor or carrier protein to get them across. So we've talked about negative feedback before. Remember when we gave our example of the thermostat that's helping to regulate the house? If it's too warm or too cold, it's bringing it back to its temperature that you have set it at. Our body works the exact same way, both with our body temperature, with our blood sugar, and with all of the hormones in our bodies. If we didn't regulate the hormones by negative feedback, that's when disease processes occur. So let's give one example of the adrenal cortex. So it produces glucocorticoids, and we'll talk way more about that when we get to the adrenal glands itself. But the hypothalamus ends up being our master regulator. So it's going to be the thing that controls the pituitary gland that secretes all of its stimulating hormones. So the pituitary gland is going to tell the target organ what to do, and the hypothalamus is going to tell the pituitary gland what to do. So if too much glucocorticoids are being produced by the adrenal gland, it'll tell the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus to stop stimulating it because it doesn't need to produce anymore. And the opposite also occurs. If there's not enough being produced, it sends a signal to the hypothalamus and pituitary gland to send more stimulating hormones, and that will tell the adrenal cortex to start producing more. So in this way, the target organ and all of its regulators, these pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, which we will talk way more in depth about, they're in constant communication to try to regulate themselves so that your body doesn't end up being in a diseased state. And we'll talk about what happens when these don't do their jobs, when disease states occur, and what could happen as a result of that. So before we get into the big major endocrine organs, let's talk a little bit about local hormones. So you have paracrine hormones and autocrine hormones. Paracrine hormones are going to work on the tissues that are surrounding these cells. So things like prostaglandins, histamine, things that are going to produce an inflammatory response. Think of when you get sick, when you have a lot of congestion, when you have an allergy response from all of the pollen outside. All of these things are being produced, and they're interacting with all of the surrounding tissues, producing this inflammatory or allergy response. And remember that prostaglandins, they used to think that they were made just in men because they only found them within the prostate, but that's because men were they're only test subjects back then. But these are found in both men and women, and they're just they're a big player in inflammation in your body. Autocrine hormones work specifically on the cell that is secreting them, so they're only regulating themselves. Things like interleukins, which are things that can cause fevers in your body, they can be a signaling chemical that something's going wrong. So sometimes pathologists will look for these if they're suspecting a lot of inflammation or specific inflammatory diseases. So the hypothalamus is part of your brain. As you can see here, it's pointing to that part of your brain, kind of anterior and medial. It's going to be the controller of a lot of things in your body, a lot of processes. It controls your thirst, your hunger, how fatigued you feel, and also your body temperature. It's also the master regulator of all of your endocrine glands. specifically the ones that are run by the anterior pituitary, which we'll talk about in just a minute. It can take over in times of severe stress. So if the anterior pituitary is very fatigued and can't do its job correctly, it can take over and do the job of the anterior pituitary for it, which is pretty cool. So it has a lot of releasing hormones, and those releasing hormones tell the anterior pituitary to produce stimulating hormones, which then get sent to specific organs so they can release their hormones. I know that sounds really complicated, but it'll make sense once we get some more context. So the pituitary gland is known as our master gland. So the master regulator is the hypothalamus, the master gland is the pituitary gland, and that's because it produces the most hormones in your entire body, specifically the anterior pituitary. So it's separated into the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. It's also in your brain, so it's a little bit inferior to the hypothalamus, and it's connected to the hypothalamus by a stalk called the infundibulum. So we'll talk a little bit more about each of those. The anterior pituitary produces a lot of the hormones in your body. It produces growth hormone, which, as you can imagine, it allows people to grow. It stimulates growth factors in the liver, so the liver also produces growth factors that help your muscles and bones grow, especially throughout puberty. Prolactin's produced here. It can be abbreviated PRL. That might be good to know for later on. And its target tissue is the breast, and it allows milk letdown when a woman is lactating after pregnancy. The anterior pituitary also produces tropic hormones. So TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. So it's going to target the thyroid to produce thyroxine, which is thyroid hormone, what controls our metabolism. It produces ACTH, adrenocorticotropin hormone, and that's going to target the adrenal glands to produce all of their various hormones. It produces FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone. If you need help with spelling those, your book is a really great resource for those. FSH and LH, they're going to target the testes and the ovaries, depending on if you're a man or woman. And we'll talk more about those functions as we get to target organs and glands. So the posterior pituitary doesn't actually make any hormones. It's a storage place for two hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. So it secretes two, but it doesn't actually make any. One of the hormones that it stores and releases is ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, as it's also called. And it helps to prevent dehydration in the body by telling the kidneys to take up water from the urine, which would make the urine more concentrated. So think about when you're really dehydrated, your urine is a darker color. That's because your body is helping to prevent you against dehydration by taking in some of that water in order to nourish its tissues. The posterior pituitary also secretes oxytocin, which is a bonding hormone. It's used in both bonding with romantic partners, with babies. When women are going through labor, oxytocin is what gives them contractions. It's also what allows them to bond with their babies post-birth. So sometimes when they have postpartum depression, there might be some deficiency in oxytocin. The pineal gland is also located in the brain. Notice that it is a little bit posterior and superior to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The pineal gland is called that because it resembles a pine nut. It is really, really tiny, and it's going to secrete melatonin. I'm sure you guys have heard of melatonin, especially as a supplement in nutrition. It's going to help you sleep, and it regulates your circadian rhythms to allow you to get into that deep, restful sleep. the secretion of melatonin is inhibited by sunlight. So that's why people get seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, which is a type of depression that's caused by the changing of seasons. Because during the winter and fall seasons, the days end up getting shorter. There's a lot more darkness outside, which allows people to feel more drowsy and kind of fatigued, and often brings about those feelings like they would get if they were depressed. So a lot of the times the treatment for that is to get one of those sunlight lamps, and that is supposed to really help with inhibiting that melatonin production. So we're finally out of the brain. Our first target gland is our thyroid gland. And it's right in the anterior part of your throat, right in the front. It sits right in front of your trachea, so your windpipe, and it's going to produce a hormone called thyroxine, which is the thyroid hormone. Your thyroid hormone is really important for things like metabolism. So if you have a really poor metabolism, it might be because you're not producing enough thyroid hormone. In order to make thyroxine, you need iodine. And iodine is kind of hard to find now in the American diet. Our soil is not as fertile as it once was. It's not, as plentiful of nutrients. So they put iodine in salt, and you might see that as iodized salt. But not everybody uses iodized salt anymore because they use the big granulated sea salt instead. It is really important that you get iodine in your diet, so make sure that when you're cooking, during cooking, you use iodized salt, and for flavor afterwards, if you want to use one of those big Himalayan sea salts or one of the bigger granulated salts, you use that for taste after you cook, and iodized salt during cooking. Remember that calcitonin is going to help bring down calcium levels in the blood, which means that calcium will be reabsorbed into the bone and used to make new bone in the body. So, Graves' disease is a condition where there's a hypersecretion of thyroxine. There's too much. It's an autoimmune condition, and some of the symptoms are exophthalmos, which means that protruding of the eyes, as you can see in this picture, weight loss, nervousness, an increased heart rate, and heat intolerance. And all of those make sense if you think about the fact that thyroxine controls your body's metabolism. So if your metabolism is really high, it would be really easy to lose weight, and you would have less excess energy that might result in things like nervousness and increased heart rate and being too warm. Hashimoto's thyroiditis is a hypothyroidism, so we don't have enough thyroxine this time. It's a hyposecretion. A lot of the times people don't, when they get a hyposecretion of the thyroid hormone, hypothyroidism, they don't have Hashimoto's itself. It's an autoimmune condition itself. Sometimes they just have hypothyroidism, and they get this condition of a goiter. So this goiter is the picture that is shown here on the side. It's a mass that forms on the thyroid. So a lot of the symptoms of hypothyroidism are the opposite of what you would consider hyperthyroidism. So with decreased metabolism, you might notice weight gain, dullness of the skin, loss of hair. Myxedema means an accumulation of fluid in the body. The mind might be a little bit cloudy. Also, you have cold intolerance, so these people might complain a lot that their hands and feet are really cold. Things of that nature. Parathyroid glands, so para means surrounding. So these little tiny yellow dots on the thyroid here that's shown are the parathyroid glands. There's 4 of them. They surround the thyroid, particularly on the posterior side of it. and they produce PTH, parathyroid hormone. And if you remember back from the skeletal lecture, they are going to increase blood calcium, and they do so by stimulating osteoclast activity to break down calcium from the bone and release it into the blood. So they do the opposite function of calcitonin. The adrenal glands are what I like to call the party hats of the kidneys. They sit right on top of the kidneys in your abdomen, and they're separated into their outer cortex and their inner medulla. And that's really important because the outer cortex has a normal glandular appearance, but the inner medulla actually has more of a nervous tissue appearance, and that's why it secretes some of the hormones that we normally consider to be neurotransmitters. So the adrenal cortex secretes 3 different categories of hormones: mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonadocorticoids. So the mineralocorticoids, our example is aldosterone. It's important for sodium homeostasis. So it increases and decreases sodium levels in the blood depending on what the body needs, what it needs as far as electrolytes are concerned. And this can play a major role in changing, either increasing or decreasing our blood pressure or heart rate, so it's a really important hormone in the body. For glucocorticoids, the one that you've probably heard of the most is cortisol. It's our stress hormone. When you're extremely stressed out, your cortisol will rise, and it will cause a lot of things like weight gain, stretch marks even, cloudy mind. For gonadocorticoids, androgens are generally secreted by the adrenal cortex. Androgens are generally what's considered to be things like testosterone, things like that nature. So Cushing's disease is a hypersecretion of cortisol. This is a disease that can be easily fixed with treatment. So symptoms is a moon-like face is what they call it. It's a rounding of the face, what's called buffalo hump, and that's just an increase in that kyphosis of the thoracic spine, right up in the upper portion, right where it meets the neck. There will also be a redistribution of the adipose tissue in the body. So what they have what's generally termed central obesity, so their abdomen may be a little protruding, but they have really thin arms and legs. They also have red stretch marks throughout their body, and they bruise really easily. So those are all classic symptoms of Cushing's disease. With treatment, they can get better really, really quickly. It may also be a thing that's chronic, though. It really depends on the cause of the Cushing's disease as to how effective the treatment is. So that was for the adrenal cortex. For the adrenal medulla, like we said, it's more closely resembling that neurosecretory tissue, the nervous tissue-like substance, and it's going to secrete hormones called catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So those are our 2 that exist as both neurotransmitters and hormones. And they're going to be important in things like our fight or flight response. They're going to increase our heart rate and allow us to be able to see far away and decrease digestion, all things in order for us to either fight or flee in a situation, if need be. So this is a list of things that are considered to be stressors. These could cause increase in cortisol in your body over time. Things could be either physical stressors, psychological stressors. Physical stressors can also be considered physiological stressors, so just keep that in mind. The pancreas is located in your abdomen, posterior to your stomach, a little bit inferior to the liver, so as you can see in this diagram. They have cells in them called, the little groupings of cells called pancreatic islets. They used to be called the islets of Langerhans, but they're trying to do away with names after people. They have both alpha and beta cells. They also have delta cells, but we won't worry about them for the purpose of this course. The alpha cells are going to secrete glucagon, and the beta cells secrete insulin. So they perform actually differing, completely opposite functions. Let's talk first about insulin, because it's something that you hear about very often in the world. Insulin is usually a drug that they give for a condition known as diabetes. And that's because in diabetes, blood sugar is really high. Insulin helps to lower blood sugar. So it tells the tissues in your body to take that sugar in so that it's not free-floating in the blood. Glucagon does quite the opposite. It's going to notice a decrease in blood sugar, and it's going to release sugar from the tissues in your body, specifically the liver and the muscle that store sugar, known as glycogen. So glucagon is a hormone that comes about in times of low blood sugar. Insulin comes about in times of high blood sugar, and they help to combat those situations. So what we know typically as diabetes is diabetes mellitus. There's both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 is known as more of the genetic juvenile form of diabetes. And this is the one that's typically treated with insulin. Type 2 diabetes is known more for the adult, later onset due to lifestyle factors such as obesity and sedentary lifestyles. Type 2 diabetes is normally treated with things like metformin, specific drugs that combat the symptoms, and there's usually a lot of lifestyle factor education involved, and hopefully a change in diet, things of that nature. The testes, obviously found in the male anatomy, they have what are known as interstitial cells, and they produce testosterone. So testosterone is really important for sperm production and also development of secondary sex characteristics in the male during puberty. And testosterone is regulated by LH, luteinizing hormone, that we talked about, that is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. The ovaries produce both estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is going to be important in development of female characteristics during puberty. Progesterone is going to promote that uterine lining for pregnancy. So every time a woman is in her cycle and she is preparing, her body's preparing for a pregnancy, progesterone is going to be nourishing that uterine lining in case an egg is implanted there that is fertilized. If in case it is not fertilized, that's when a woman undergoes menstruation and ends up having her monthly period. So that uterine lining would then be sloughed off and flushed out as part of menstruation. Progesterone and estrogen are both regulated by follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone also plays a part in male endocrine reproduction, but it's not quite as complex as female endocrine reproduction. One of our temporary endocrine organs is the placenta, which is only found during pregnancy. It produces a hormone called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, which is the hormone that is detected during a pregnancy test. The placenta also produces estrogen, progesterone, and relaxin, which all help during the pregnancy in maintaining a healthy lining for the baby and a healthy womb for it to grow in. The thymus is an endocrine gland that sits in your mediastinum in your chest. It sits right in front of your heart. It's going to atrophy with age, so it's only really super functional in early age, and as you get older into your late adulthood, that thymus gland ends up becoming more fatty tissue than it has any glandular function. But it primarily secretes thymosin, which helps to create some of the white blood cells in our body. and mature them. So the thymus, although it does secrete a hormone, plays more of a immune system function than it does an endocrine function. Additionally, you have hormones known as leptin and ghrelin. They're super important in producing the feeling of hunger and of feeling full. So leptin is produced by your adipose cells. It lets you know when you're full. Ghrelin is produced by your stomach lining, and then it lets you know when you're hungry. So your empty stomach causes ghrelin levels to rise, and it signals your brain to tell you that you're hungry and you need to start eating. Your leptin signals your brain to tell your stomach to stop eating, and so on and so on. So the balance of these hormones is actually really important, as you can imagine, in things like obesity. So a lot of the times you can actually be leptin resistant, and it's kind of like being insulin resistant in a way, and your body can't really sense that you're full as much as you would typically. So that's it for the endocrine system. Let me know if you have any questions. We could always link up on Skype or FaceTime to review any information that you need help reviewing.